Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram 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 Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna 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 Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram 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 Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram 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 Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna 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 Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram 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 Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna 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 Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram 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 Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram 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 Hari 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 Krishna 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 Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram 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 Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna 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 Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram. Okay. Haribol, devotees, prednia, lekция начинается. Hmm? No, it's fine, thanks. Right. Devotees, Haribol, Prabhupada-lilamrita. Oh, yes. So what do they, at the end of the class? Okay. Well, and what do they do? How do they connect up to it?
There's a website, so you can go to
Oh my gosh.
on Facebook and then register.
Write it down.
Okay, and I'll give it a table here.
Yeah. Okay. Nama Vishnupadaya Krishna Presta Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gaura Brahmi Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastya Chadesh Tarne Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prananitananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivas Adi Gopatavanda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchikapatarupyas Jakripas Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. So devotees, we are continuing reading. Oi. Пожалуйста, контролируйте звук лучше. Let's try again. So devotees, we are now just beginning chapter... What now? Just a moment. Excuse me, we got a sound mix-up here. We got to address. What now? Here it is. You got it? Okay. Excuse me, devotees. Right. So we are now starting chapter 5 of Prabhupada-lilamrita. Chapter 5 is titled The War. Hare Krishna. And there's a little introductory sentence, actually, it's just one sentence from Srila Prabhupada, just to introduce the chapter. Under the circumstances since 1936 up to now, I was simply speculating whether I shall venture this difficult task, and that without any means and capacity. But as none have discouraged me, I have now taken courage to take up the work. Okay. So now we begin chapter 5, the text. And you may remember yesterday we were reading how Srila Prabhupada met with Srila Bhaktisiddhanta on some occasions personally. And one time, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta said, was complaining about or commenting about how some of his disciples, when they opened the big temple in Calcutta, which was sort of like their headquarters, at least their biggest temple, that some of the disciples were fighting over which room they would get. They wanted the best room. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta commented that he really didn't like this at all. And he felt that maybe we should take all the marble off the temple and sell it and print books. And in this way, Prabhupada understood that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta really liked the printing of Krishna-conscious books. But one thing that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta said was, Agun Jwalbe. Agun Jwalbe means there will be a fire. Yeah. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was afraid that when he left this world, that fighting would break out amongst the disciples and the whole mission would become very detrimentally affected, and this would be like a fire which would burn through the mission, this fire of arguments and who's in charge, and rather than being serious to spread Krishna consciousness cooperatively. Okay, so we begin here. The fire in the mat broke out almost immediately after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta passed away. A senior disciple said that there should be one Acharya who would be the spiritual successor to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati and who would perform all initiations and settle all controversies. But Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had never said that. He had never called for one Acharya. Rather, he had instructed the members of the Gaudiya Math to form a governing body of 12 men and carry on a concerted effort. But that instruction was abandoned, and the suggestion that there be one leader took hold. A single person, instead of 12, should take charge. And now it became a rush for who? Yes, well, you know, this is a really important point, that the order of the spiritual master is the active principle, or should be the active principle in the life of a devotee. Just like sometimes if you make some sort, anyway, active principle, one thing I can say is that when you, anyway, I won't get into fiberglass, but the active principle means the thing which brings everything together. Yeah. The thing that brings everything together. You may have different things around, but the active principle can bring all the different things that are around, bring them together. Yes, so the order of the spiritual master is meant to be the active principle in the life of the devotee, of the disciple. Yes, that the devotee has life, has intelligence, has maybe some resources, some money or something, but the order of the spiritual master, when the order of the spiritual master comes, then all those different things should be used to facilitate, to carry out the order of the spiritual master. Yes. So that's the active principle. It gives the other things life, and without which the other things just don't really have life. So it's a very important principle in Krishna consciousness, that we shouldn't speculate about doing this, doing that, and we certainly shouldn't do nothing. But what should we do? We should do what is ordered by the spiritual master. So, two parties contested. Ananta Vasudev, one of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's leading preachers, was ambitious, and he pressed his claim with a group of influential sannyasi supporters. Another man, Kunjabihari, shrewdly went after the properties. He had been a leading administrator under Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, and now he claimed ownership of the palatial temple in Calcutta, as well as all the other properties and assets of the India-wide Gaudiya Math. Although in his will, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had expressed his desire that his disciples select a governing board to manage all properties and funds of the Gaudiya Math, Kunjabihari contested the will's legitimacy. He and his supporters argued that since Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had received the properties on behalf of God, he was not their rightful owner and therefore could not determine their future ownership. Thus he and the others disputed over the legal and theological aspects of the former Acharya's position. So our Srila Prabhupada discusses actually in Chaitanya Charitamrita, Adi Leela, I forget the chapter number, but it's the chapter about Advaita Acharya. Srila Prabhupada was extremely unhappy about these things happening. One person, clever preacher, that's good. But now, even though Srila Bhaktisiddhanta ordered that no one person should become the next leader, but rather a group of 12 should oversee everything, but that one clever preacher, he really tried to win support for having himself as the leader. And the other one, even though Srila Bhaktisiddhanta left a will, Kunjabihari contested the will. And tried to say that what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta said in the will should not be followed in order to get control of the properties. It was so bad, just so bad. And this is one of the good things about ISKCON, is that Srila Prabhupada, he was able, I shouldn't say he was able to convince the devotees, but by the direction of Srila Prabhupada, a governing body was formed. Actually, he formed it himself some years before he passed away. But that governing body has carried on and is overseeing everything. And even though challenges come, but the governing body is able to carry on and oversee everything. And no influential person or persons are able to take control over the governing body. Srila Shortly after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's passing away, litigation had begun. They took it to the courts, and Prabhupada comments there in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. That particular part he wrote, translated and wrote purports in 1974. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta passed away January 1st, 1937, we read. And Prabhupada says that litigation is still going on till that day. I don't know, maybe it got settled later somehow or other, but between 1937, January the 1st, and 1974, so that's 37 years, things had not been settled. It's crazy, completely absurd. Yes. So, okay. Shortly after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's passing away, litigation had begun. Ananta Vasudeva, supported by a majority of the members of the Gaudiya Math, had claimed that he, as the next Acharya, was the owner and director of the properties. But although Kunja Bihari had only a few supporters, he defied the majority by pressing his claim through lawyers in court. Kunja Bihari and his men had possession of the Chaitanya Math and the temples in Mayapur. Vasudeva's party captured other buildings. Quarreling and fistfights broke out. The preaching of the Gaudiya Math stopped. Abai's inability to take part in the activities of the Gaudiya Math was suddenly in his favor. He had always been more a visitor than a member at the Math, and at least externally, more the Grihastha businessman than a missionary worker. This automatically put him at a distance from the fray. Of course, he was associated with the Maths in Bombay and Allahabad, but he had no managerial position, no claims to ownership, and no role in the litigation, nor did he desire to take sides in the struggle for power. Like many of the other disciples, he was mortified to see that his spiritual master's instructions for cooperation had been disregarded and his mission thrown into a legal dispute. Abai knew that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had wanted the leaders to work cooperatively, and so he could not sympathize with the warring factions. Both parties were an insult to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. Yeah, that's true. Great insult, terrible insult, actually. It's really just such a horrible thing. But he wanted to preach. Although becoming a very good English preacher, quote unquote, was something he was meditating on more than actively doing, the Gaudiya Math would logically have been the vehicle for his preaching. He had already contributed articles to the Gaudiya Math's publications and had been working with his godbrothers at the Allahabad and Bombay centers. Naturally, he thought of serving his spiritual master in terms of serving within his spiritual master's mission. But the Gaudiya Math, which had always been known for pure, bold preaching of the message of Lord Chaitanya, was now becoming known for embroiled factions. As the Gaudiya Math broke down, he was also affected. Under the present circumstances, How could he carry out his spiritual master's order to preach? Previously, the main obstacle to his preaching had been family commitments, but now the obstacles were compounded. Now he had to wait helplessly for the outcome of the struggle. What would Krishna bring about? So now, 1938, his Bombay business diminishing, Abai, now 42, moved back to Calcutta with his wife and family and rented a house at 6 Sitakanta Banerjee Lane. The street was but a narrow lane, lined on either side with 3-story houses. His office was on the first floor, facing the street. The family lived upstairs. He rented the adjoining building, number 7, and on the first floor operated a small chemical laboratory manufacturing distilled water, Day's pain liniment, Vimal tonic, Alpa, an injection for boils, and various other medicines. He also utilized a small outbuilding in the rear as part of his lab. Out front, he hung a large signboard, Abhay Charan Day and Sons, displaying a picture of a mustached Abhay Charan. Sometimes he would employ 2 or 3 servants to assist him, but mostly he worked alone. And he would deliver his glass jugs of distilled water to agents such as Bengal Company and Gluconet. He printed a brochure advertising Day's pain liniment, which said, "Good for relieving gout, rheumatism, and all pains." And if one wanted to be free of recurring diseases like rheumatism and gout, Abhai's brochure directed that in addition to using Day's pain liniment, one refrain from alcohol and all sorts of drinking or intoxicating habits, and food and drink should be very simple and innocent, just such as vegetables and milk. The new Calcutta business enjoyed an early success, but Abhay didn't have his heart in it. It was a duty. He had to do it to maintain his family. His new acquaintances in Calcutta found him to be a devotee of God at heart, a businessman, a family man, but more concerned with writing and preaching than with business and family. Chandi Mukherjee, a neighbor from nearby Bihari Street. Quote, "He was interested only in devotional activities and did his business only to maintain the family. He didn't seem interested in the profit motive, in accumulating money or becoming a rich man." Unquote. Charan Mukherjee, Abhai's next-door neighbor, quote, "Abhay Charan Day was always a very patient listener to every illogical argument that anybody, including myself, would bring to him. Not knowing philosophy, I would illogically present so many arguments, and Mr. Day would always very patiently listen. Nothing agitated him. He was always very calm, and he taught me about God. He would speak only of Krishna. He was translating the Gita and was maintaining his business." Unquote. Neighbors would often see him sitting on his cot in the front room. He would read his spiritual master's books and sometimes recite the Sanskrit shlokas out loud. He liked to discuss philosophy with anyone who came by. His family keeping mostly upstairs, Abai would sit alone in the downstairs front room, dressed in dhoti and kurta, or sometimes a dhoti and only a vest. Often he would be at his writing, while outside the door his children played with the children of the Ganguly family, who lived in the rear apartment of the same building. The neighbors lived openly in a kind of joint neighborhood family, and Abai talked freely with the other neighbors, but of Vaishnav philosophy and only rarely of business. Mr. Ganguly found Abai's speech scholastic and always very philosophical. Abai was absorbed in the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, and even in brief conversations, he would refer to Lord Krishna and to Bhagavad Gita's description of Lord Krishna as the basis of both the material and spiritual worlds. While working in his laboratory or receiving a delivery of empty bottles from the Muslim bottle merchant or going out to sell his medicine, he would be talking or thinking about God. In those days, for a person in Calcutta to be interested in God consciousness was not so unusual. Abai found even a man like Abdullah, the Muslim bottle merchant, to be very religious. One day, Abai asked Abdullah, who had once been very poor but had become rich by his business. So Abai said, "Now you've got money, so how are you going to use your money?" The bottle merchant replied, "My dear sir, I have an intention to construct a mosque." Meanwhile, the war of the Gaudiya Math raged on. Both factions were ill-motivated, and both deviated from the instructions of their spiritual master. The very act of trying to determine ownership of the properties through legal action meant that the godbrothers were disobeying the express desire of their spiritual master, as stated in his will. The litigation continued year after year, but the legal wrangling could not bring them together or purify them. One court ruled in favor of Ananta Vasudev, but then a higher court awarded 2/3 of the Math's properties to Kunja Bihari and 1/3 to Vasudev. Still, although Vasudev had fewer properties, he inspired more followers. He seemed to them more intent on reviving the preaching of the Gaudiya Math. But when Vasudev subsequently fell down from the principles of sannyas by going off with a woman, the groups broke further to pieces. Yeah, that's what happened. Prabhupada talks about that. You know, he wanted to become the big acharya, but somehow he became attracted to some woman, or maybe one way or another, one way or another. He got involved with a woman and ran off with her. Amazing. Most of the sannyasis continued to make their principles, but many now left the jurisdiction of the two contending factions in disgust. Individuals formed their own ashrams, Gaudiya Mission, Chaitanya Gaudiya Math, and others. The unified entity of Gaudiya Math as an all-India mission, consisting of many temples, several presses, and hundreds of devotees working cooperatively under one leadership, ceased to exist. Godbrothers continued to uphold the teachings of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as they'd received them from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, But because they were meant to work together, they lacked their former united potency. Illusions of proprietorship and prestige had superseded the spiritual master's order, and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's cause, a worldwide movement for propagating Lord Chaitanya's teachings, collapsed. Wow. It's incredible, isn't it? Yeah, just incredible. So, we have to follow, for us, we have to follow Srila Prabhupada and follow those who follow Srila Prabhupada and work with those who follow Srila Prabhupada. This is the essence. Otherwise, as described here, these two groups deviated from the instructions of the spiritual master and, as a result, collapsed. So now the Gaudiya Math is not one organization at all. It's a number, I don't know how many, it might be a dozen or so, or might even be a little more, I don't actually know. Just independent organizations, just doing their own thing, and occasionally they get together, but not very much at all. And they don't do any substantial projects. It's amazing. And the reason for that is that when you disobey the order of the spiritual master, you lose your potency. You may be intelligent, creative, clever in this way or that, in Krishna consciousness. But if you disobey the orders of the spiritual master, then you won't be able to do much. Maybe you can do it. You can do a little something, but not something really worthwhile. Yes. So, this is what happens when a person deviates from the instructions of the spiritual master. They lose the potency. They lose the Shakti. Just like Lord Chaitanya says in, well, it's actually Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami says in Chaitanya Charitamrita about someone who has the mercy of the spiritual master, has the mercy of Lord Chaitanya. That mercy of Lord Chaitanya comes through the mercy of the spiritual master. So Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami says, by the mercy of Lord Chaitanya, a lame man can climb mountains. A blind man can see the stars in the sky. And a young child can understand the conclusive truths of the Vedic scriptures. It's amazing what can be done by anyone if they follow the spiritual master, if they follow Lord Chaitanya. But otherwise, if one is really not doing that, then one may apparently be intelligent and clever in so many ways, but one will not be able to achieve anything really substantial. Okay, let's continue. Wherever Abai went, he seemed to attract the company of his godbrothers. Some followers of Sridhar Maharaj, the same Sridhar with whom he had worked in Bombay, and whom he had always regarded as a good devotee and scholar. So some of his followers met Abai at his place on Banerjee Lane and told this news to Sridhar Maharaj, who was then living at his own ashram in Mayapur. Sridhar Maharaj had disaffiliated himself from the factions of the Gaudiya Math, but as a sannyasi who was still preaching and was interested in publishing Vaishnav literature. He had wanted to maintain an ashram in Calcutta, so for 20 rupees a month, he rented from a Bai the 4 rooms on the 2nd floor of number 7, above Abai's chemical laboratory. Now, whenever they came to Calcutta, Sridhar Maharaj, Puri Maharaj, and Bhakti Saranga Maharaj based themselves there, staying in small separate rooms. It became a regular ashram for sannyasis and brahmacharis, and Sridhar Maharaj put a sign out front, Devananda Saraswati Mat. Sridhar Maharaj's establishment of a mat in Mayapur with a branch in Calcutta was his response to the Gaudiya Math split. Like other sannyasis, he had been initiating disciples and preaching, not waiting for the outcome of the litigation with its continued appeals and counterclaims. Well, I can just mention that Srila Prabhupada said that this Kunjabi Hari, who was not a preacher, but was very clever and good in like business and legal affairs, even while Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was present, was living, he was taking money from the Kunjabi Hari was taking money from the Gaudiya Math. And he had a number of sons, I'm not sure how many, but some, maybe 4 or so sons or something. He put them through university with that money and had them all studying law, and they all became qualified in law. This is while Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was living. But he did that, so when Srila Bhaktisiddhanta left, he'd have a good team of lawyers for making sure that they were able to hold on to all the buildings. Right. Abai was glad to encourage Sridhar Maharaj and the others who joined him at his little ashram. Here, Abai and Sridhar Maharaj and his followers could remain aloof from the warring factions and together pursue their plans for spreading Krishna consciousness. The sannyasis cooked in their separate kitchen, performed their puja, and held morning and evening kirtans and lectures. Abai remained with his family, taking his own meals and performing his own puja. But he often went to discuss Srimad Bhagavatam with Sridhar Maharaj. From his roof, Abai could see the towering steeple of his spiritual master's building, the Gaudiya Math of Bag Bazar, its ownership now contested by bitter factions. Abai would often accompany Sridhar Maharaj and his assistants at preaching programs where he would play the mridanga. And when Sridhar Maharaj fell ill, Abai led the other devotees on preaching engagements, performing kirtan, playing mridanga, and giving lectures on the Bhagavatam. Sridhar Maharaj, quote, "We did not see Abai as working very hard for making money, nor did he seem very rich or to have a lot of liquid funds. He was attracted more to the spiritual side of affairs than to his family affairs. He never discussed business prospects with me, whether the business was up or down, or whether he was planning to do this or that. Monetarily, he did not have sufficient funds for giving any to the mission. Abai began to think seriously about writing Vaishnav literature. His spiritual master had seemed very pleased and had told the editor of The Harmonist, whatever he writes, publish it. Business profits, if he could somehow expand them, could go for printing books in English, as his spiritual master had said, if you ever get money, print books, unquote. Certainly the Gaudiya Math was not going to do it. Kunjabi Hari had sold Bhaktisiddhanta's printing presses to offset his legal expenses. No, Abai would have to continue on his own, maintaining his business and simultaneously trying to write and publish. And that was also the prescription of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. It is better that he is living outside your company. When the time comes, he will do everything himself. So you remember we read that last night. Yeah, it was it Sridhar Maharaj? Anyway, it was one of them talking to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta about Prabhupada, who of course was householder and quite involved in business at that point. So the devotee said to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, that, like to the effect that he should give up his business, Srila Prabhupada, and just come and join the temple and preach. But Srila Bhaktisiddhanta said, it's better that he live outside your company. When the time comes, he'll do everything himself. So, someone on the level of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta maybe had some vision into the future. Certainly he understood what was best for Prabhupada. And he felt it was best that Prabhupada stay separate and work on what he was able to work on. It was in 1939 that Abai wrote Introduction to Gita Upanishad. It was a short piece, but it signaled his intention to take on the task of one day translating Bhagavad Gita into English with commentary. Of course, there were already many commentaries in English, but most of them had been written by impersonalists or others who had not delivered the original spirit of the Gita, the spirit of Arjuna on the battle of Kurukshetra, hearing Bhagavad Gita directly from Lord Krishna. Abai knew, however, that he could present Bhagavad Gita in the proper spirit by writing an English commentary based on the teachings of Lord Chaitanya and the disciplic succession. So he began. Whenever he could make time, he would write. Although a strict grammarian could find fault in his English composition, his meaning was always clear. In his introduction, Abai reflected on the time when, as a young schoolboy, he had attended a lecture, Vidyaratna, a jewel of education, the jewel of education. The theme of the lecture had been that God does not exist and could not exist. If there were a God, he would certainly have appeared on earth to put an end to all religious rivalry. But since God had not obliged man in this way, we should banish all thought of his existence from our minds. The audience, Abai explained, consisting only of so many young boys, did not delve deeply into the subject matter of the lecture, yet the majority, impressed by the arguments, carried away lofty ideas of godlessness and thus became agnostics at home. Abai had not been satisfied with the agnostic conclusion. He said, because I'd been trained by my father to be engaged in the worship of Shishi Radha Govinda, but as a result of the Vidya Ratna lecture, I was experiencing some mental conflict between agnosticism and the existence of Godhead, unquote. Later, having heard from his spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, Abai understood that the personality of Godhead exists in every sphere of activity. Prabhupada Abai wrote, but we do not have the eyes to see him. Even if the Lord personally manifests himself on earth, the quarreling mundaners will not stop their fighting and look upon Godhead or his representative due to ignorance. This is the birthright of the individual soul by the grace of God. Bhagavad Gita is the true jewel of education, and in the Gita, Lord Krishna declares to the fighting people on earth, here I am, do not quarrel. The agnostic who had spoken of the jewel of education had been blinded by the jewel and therefore could not see and appreciate the personality of Godhead. Thus he had gone on to convince others to become so-called jewels also. Following his spiritual master, Abai displayed an aggressive spirit for confronting all opponents of pure theism. In responding to his spiritual master's order to develop into an English preacher, Abai was not simply making neutral scholarly presentations. He was willing and ready to fight, whether against modern agnostics or Vaishnavism's old, traditional enemy, Mayavad impersonalism. Although few scholars taught the way of surrender to Lord Krishna as espoused in Bhagavad Gita, almost all respected Bhagavad Gita as presenting the essence of all knowledge. The Gita, therefore, was the perfect vehicle for confronting those who misrepresented God and religion. The Gita was, quote, a challenge to the agnostics, apotheosists, anthropomorphists, impersonalists, henotheists, pantheists, and absolute monists. Although there were already more than 600 commentaries on Bhagavad Gita, they had been written by persons with, quote, an inner hatred for the personality of Godhead, unquote, and therefore they were imperfect. Quote, such envious persons, Abai wrote, have no entrance into the real meaning of Bhagavad Gita, inasmuch as a fly cannot enter into the covered jar of honey. Yes, so all these different schools of thoughts with all these crazy ideas. And Srila Prabhupada made the point, when he came to the Western world, he made the point that, he said that before I came, there were many versions of Bhagavad Gita in English, but not one of them had produced one devotee of Krishna. But when Prabhupada published his Bhagavad Gita as it is, then hundreds and thousands of people became devotees. So this is really a very important point that, it's sort of the same point as what we were just talking about the potency. If one doesn't follow the instructions of the spiritual master, one will not receive the potency to spread Krishna consciousness. So, yes, all these people with all their concocted ideas, there's no mercy coming to them, so they can't do anything. They basically can't do anything. Abai described Indian culture as an almost impassable ocean due to its depth of thought and apparent mixtures of conclusions. But in this book, Abai declared, I will establish that Krishna is the absolute personality of Godhead by referring to the available records of scriptures, which are the recorded history of Indian culture and thought. The sannyasis at 7 Banerjee Lane were impressed by the scope of Abai's thought and intentions. As it was customary to award a title to an especially worthy Vaishnav according to his qualities, Bhakti Saranga Goswami wanted to confer upon Abai the title Bhakti Siddhanta. Sridhar Maharaj, however, thought it inappropriate to give Abai the same title as their spiritual master, and he asked that Abai's title be changed to Bhakti Vedanta. Bhakti meaning devotion, and Vedanta meaning the end of knowledge. Abai was grateful. The title combined the devotion of religion with the scholarship of the most rigorous philosophy as passed down by the scholarly followers of Lord Chaitanya. He appreciated the sincere gesture of his godbrothers and accepted the title as a further commitment to his spiritual path of preaching Krishna consciousness. Abai continued regularly associating with Sridhar Maharaj and discussing with him Srimad Bhagavatam. Abai encouraged him to preach widely, although Sridhar Maharaj was admittedly more the scholar and rather shy about going out and preaching. On several occasions, Abai tried to convince Sridhar Maharaj to go with him and charge Gandhi and Nehru as to why they weren't following the principles of Bhagavad Gita. Another fruit of the spiritual association at 7 Banerjee Lane was a book called Prabhupada-lilamrita, compiled by Sridhar Maharaj. A collection of verses from various Vaishnav scriptures, including excerpts from the works of Rupa Goswami. It was divided into 6 chapters according to the 6 divisions of surrender. Abai, along with the sannyasis of the Devananda Saraswati Mat, financed the publication. Thus it was published as a joint effort by friends. Okay, devotees, just before you go, here's a message. So there's a long weekend coming up, right? At least in South Africa. Friday is off. So for the long weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I will be giving or partaking in a seminar called Spring Cleaning the Garden of the Heart. It'll take place from 5:45 South African time till 8 South African time in the evening, 17:45 to 2000. Yeah. To register for this course, go onto the following link.
The link is on the comments. It's pinned. the
I can
screen.
see it. Oh, it's here.
Yeah, it's here on the screen.
Oh, it's on the screen.
Yeah, like on Facebook.
Oh, is it? Okay.
And they can go, it's pinned there.
Okay. So the link is on Facebook, my English Facebook.
Yeah, on your business page.
Right.
In the comments, it's pinned.
Okay. So, yeah. So go get the following link or contact info@mindfultrinity.co.za. Mindful Trinity, MINDFULTRINITY, all one word, .co.za. The link will also be available in the comments of this class. You will receive an ebook and Zoom link after payment is made. Hope to see you there. Okay, devotees, Hare Krishna, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.